And Federated Farmers lodged a series of vexatious appeals, basically starting 4 or 5 years ago. First of all, to the Environment Court, where they spectacularly lost on all points of law. Then to the High Court, where yet again they were absolutely unable to articulate or make a sound legal argument. And Justice Mary Peters was quite withering and scathing and awarded partial costs against them. Then it was on to the Court of Appeal, another vexatious appeal attempting to overturn Principal Environment Court Judge Newhook's and Justice Mary Peters' unequivocal decision in our local council's favor. Finally, Federated Farmers withdrew that appeal to the Court of Appeal, but then, as Whangarei District Council was working closely with Northland Regional Council, trying to strengthen and tighten up those strong precautionary GMO provisions, Federated Farmers again lodged opposition to what our councils were trying to do. And it is only, Tim, in the last month, on the 12th of April, that Principal Environment Court Judge Newhook released his latest decision on the 12th of April, in which he absolutely slammed Federated Farmers of New Zealand.
Hi, this is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Green Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings, and welcome to Green Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch, and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth. We here in nuclear-free New Zealand are still known as a GE-free country. And though there have been some sneaky intrusions of entities planting small lots of GE plants, these have been quashed and dealt with. But we have to be eternally vigilant. For what we have in this verdant country, we must make sure our children and grandchildren are the recipient of our legacy of taking care of their future. Today we have our new Prime Minister, who at the time of this interview is expecting of her first newborn. Naturally, we wish her and this little being a joyful and prosperous, healthy life. That, as a loving mother, she'll be able to take advantage of the virtues of clean green New Zealand and feed her little baby over the years healthy, nutrient-dense organic food, full of life force and vitality. And that we New Zealanders can continue to grow nutritious, wholesome food, uncontaminated by GMOs, and being a totally GE-free country. This is our wish for all children. On the phone from Northland this morning, I have Zelka Grammer. She is the chairperson of GE-free Northland, and we have a wonderful story to tell. And so, without any further ado, kia ora, Zelka.
Kia ora, Tim.
Zelka, we've been working for a long time, particularly you, to make sure that the Grand Peninsula of Northland, from Auckland up, becomes GE-free. And we have made some wonderful progress. Please tell the listeners why we can celebrate.
Well, I think the really good news is that Northland and Auckland are still GE-free. We have always been that way. But the problem is that we've had a series of aggressive multinationals, Crown Research Institute, basically people wanting to use our region to do risky GE experiments out of doors, which is unacceptable. And we have been working very closely and constructively with every council from South Auckland right up to the far north to make sure that additional protections are put in place for our region.
Yes, this is a great landmark decision, because all that land in Northland is going to be, in many ways, a pristine sort of organic landmass, and so that for people who are growing food for their family or exporters, they're going to have a huge advantage, because people will want to buy the best food that this country can produce. So can you extend on how this whole process came about? Because you've been doing it for nearly 1.5 decades. Gosh.
Yes, well, we're getting close to, I think it all started back in 1995. And we have an organic farm near Whangarei. And basically one day I got a phone call from some of my horticulturalist and orchardist mates who were in quite a panic because there had been a risky outdoor GE field trial with transgenic tamarillos put in place near Kerikeri at the Hort Research Facility. And obviously beekeepers and orchardists and primary producers were quite worried about this being situated in the north. And I looked into it and was really shocked to find out that not only was the head scientist, Dr. Dan Cohen at the time, using a very controversial virus, what they call a viral promoter, but also the containment that they had for these genetically engineered trees was unbelievably poor. And they didn't allow us into the site. People basically needed to break in and await the sun to rise and take photographic evidence. And we went to the Royal Commission into genetic modification a few years later with our evidence, and that was our first experience with the incompetence and arrogance of New Zealand Crown Research Institutes, or those who want to do outdoor experiments in our region. So that definitely lit a fire under a lot of people.
Yes, very much so. So the Whangarei District Council and the Far North District Council, there's been this collaboration that's taken us to a victory. Can you explain a little bit more? Because I was involved way back in around about 2009, 2010, where I, from my standpoint, living here in Auckland, I wanted to make sure that Auckland would become GE-free, so it would be the gatekeeper for all of Northland. And so nothing really could infiltrate, come up through the south and get...
Exactly.
And so I was involved in going and presenting to the board at the Rodney District Council, and I did have to... I had to really get stuck in there at one stage because one of the board, who's now actually moved on to become part of the New Zealand party, was a little bit reticent. But anyway, the whole thing was, then we took it to the next step. A couple of years later, we went into the Auckland Council, and I remember sitting beside a New Zealander, Sir John Walker, the Olympian, who won gold medals and world records for middle distance running, and he said it is imperative that we have to know what's in our food, and I was comforted by that. And so,
how wonderful. And you're exactly right. Northland and the Auckland Peninsula is ideally placed geographically to achieve this distinction of being an enforceable GE-free zone. Obviously, we've always been GE-free, but we need to have those robust rules and policies in place so that when people apply to the EPA down in Wellington and the bureaucrats in Wellington give it the rubber stamp, then there's this additional tier of protection and that they're not allowed to come into our region. And this process has been going on for quite some time. Initially, the first councils to join what is called the Northland Auckland Intercouncil Working Party on GMO Risk and Evaluation Options. It's a very posh title. But at the beginning, it was only the Northland councils. First, Kaipara District Council, Whangarei District Council, and Far North District Council, then the Northland Regional Council. And at a certain point, after they had done some initial research and commissioned some independent reports and legal opinions, and the council realized, to their horror, that everything that their farmers and local ratepayers were saying was true about the risks of outdoor use of GMOs, about the inadequacies of the national legislation. And after that, Auckland came on board. And you'll recall that Auckland had quite a few of the original symbolic GE-free zones. Do you remember that? It was in Western Bays and Waiheke Island and Mount Albert, We also had some in Northland as well. There was Nelson, Buller, Napier.
Yes,
But what needed to happen was the transition from those valuable symbolic GE-free zone policies, which Waitakere, the eco-city, had, to actually having enforceable rules and provisions in local plans, because that's what makes people sit up and take notice. That is what is a deterrent.
Very good. Yes, I wanted that you to explain that very clearly. Yes. So could you take the story further on, because it was a battle?
Oh, well, and the thing is even after, so the process was getting those precautionary and prohibitive policies in the council's long-term plans. It was getting outright prohibition of any GE or GMOs in the Hauraki Gulf and Islands. Do you remember that in the district plan?
Yes, oh yes.
And as those various Auckland councils and, of course, Rodney District Council were absorbed into the new flash Auckland councils, we're very pleased that Auckland Council did honor all those wonderful legacy GE-free policies and working constructively and in a fiscally responsible collaborative manner with the Northland councils. The various councils put in place strong precautionary and prohibitive provisions, including in the Auckland Unitary Plan. The problem was, though, is that even though this was a wonderful example of democracy in action and the local councils acting on their duty of care to their constituents and the environment, and particularly, of course, to their primary producers, their farmers, their beekeepers, their foresters, horticulturalists. The problem is that as soon as the councils began to take action, they became subject to litigation. And we had Federated Farmers of New Zealand, we had the various New Zealand Crown Research Institutes, Scion, Ag Research, Plant and Food Research, lodging submissions against the council's excellent work. And then, at a certain point, when they were unsuccessful, largely because resoundingly the people, the actual ratepayers, made so many submissions and made such a compelling argument that they prevailed against these outside interests, if you like. But then we had Federated Farmers of New Zealand taking our councils to the court. And particularly in the case of the Northland Regional Council with the proposed regional policy statement, which is the overarching regional plan for the next 10 years, the Northland Regional Council only had strong precautionary GMO provisions. It was identified as an issue of significance for Northland Tangata Whenua, an issue of concern for Northland communities, and of particular concern to local iwi and hapu, the risks of GMOs to indigenous biodiversity.
Yes.
So what was in there was quite fair and balanced. It wasn't outright prohibition of everything, which, of course, would be highly desirable, but at that stage, that's what we had. And Federated Farmers lodged a series of vexatious appeals, basically starting 4 or 5 years ago. First of all, to the Environment Court, where they spectacularly lost on all points of law. Then to the High Court, where yet again they were absolutely unable to articulate or make a sound legal argument. And Justice Mary Peters was quite withering and scathing and awarded partial costs against them. Then it was on to the Court of Appeal, another vexatious appeal attempting to overturn Principal Environment Court Judge Newhook's and Justice Mary Peters' unequivocal decision in our local council's favor. Finally, Federated Farmers withdrew that appeal to the Court of Appeal, but then, as Whangarei District Council was working closely with Northland Regional Council, trying to strengthen and tighten up those strong precautionary GMO provisions, Federated Farmers again lodged opposition to what our councils were trying to do. And it is only, Tim, in the last month, on the 12th of April, that Principal Environment Court Judge Newhook released his latest decision on the 12th of April, in which he absolutely slammed Federated Farmers of New Zealand. He said that the appeal was vexatious, that it was extremely illogical and difficult to follow, even what they were trying to say, that their arguments were, I'm quoting from the judgment, a series of non sequiturs, basically sentences following on from each other, making no logical sense, and basically said that we could go for full costs, and that Federated Farmers of New Zealand would not be running these arguments again, that it was not open to them.
Yes, well, this is fantastic. I mean, what's happened, these people at the top who can see money and contributions from large corporations but they're looking only at money. They're not actually looking at any principle or any ethics, and they're not looking for the children or any of the biota of our planet.
But actually, even on a financial level, it doesn't make logical sense. When you have the huge consumer backlash and market aversion to any GE food, when people are discerning customers who buy what New Zealand exports, they don't want GE. They won't even accept trace contamination of GE. Yes. It actually doesn't even make logical sense to go down that road. And all the arguments that the pro-biotech or the Monsantos of the world were spinning 15 years ago, that GE crops had higher yields and lower herbicide use and all these supposed benefits and advantages, well, none of that has ever come to light. So basically, they were just making false claims of benefit, which has completely turned out to not be true, because the USDA figures for the yields of the GE crops versus conventional, it's all basically, a load of bull. And there's been some very important, independent, peer-reviewed scientists published internationally making comparative studies between the U.S. that went down the GE road and the European Union that did not, and the fact that in the EU they have higher yields and lower herbicide use and lots of benefits. So basically, we're very, very proud of so many New Zealanders and also our hardworking councils who did not fall for that PR spin and hype, and the councils who have worked so hard acting on their duty of care to their ratepayers and to the environment.
Yes, very impressed with the Whangarei District Council and the Far North District Council. They just kept true to what they needed to do, and so we're extremely thankful. Now, another big thing...
And may I just interject, that was the other thing, is that when Whangarei District Council and Far North District Council, in keeping with the wishes of their farmers and ratepayers, collaboratively produced two excellent GMO plan changes to make any release of GMOs a prohibited activity, but making any outdoor GE experiments a discretionary activity. Now, that meant that someone applied to the EPA to do something in those districts, and it was rubber-stamped, as they always are,
yes,
down in Wellington.
Regrettably,
which really needs addressing under this new government. Those applicants, those successful applicants who easily cleared this easy hurdle down in Wellington, if they wanted to come to our districts or region, they then would have to produce a number of things. They'd have to post a substantive bond, and we're talking millions of dollars.
Thank you.
They would have to prove financial fitness and basically be personally and financially liable for any unintended or unforeseen adverse impacts of their EPA-approved activities.
Correct.
And funnily enough, all the people, including Dr. William Rolleston, the former president of Federated Farmers, and the New Zealand Crown Research Institutes and various companies who claim that the GE experiments or whatever it was that they were trying to do would be so valuable and be a great money spinner and of huge benefit, and that the risks were not only low, they kept using the phrase negligible, which I think negligible means so small that it's almost unimportant or not worth considering.
Yes.
They claimed that, and yet when it came to actually ponying up and being accountable and proving financial fitness and posting a bond, all of a sudden they weren't interested.
Yes.
And then Federated Farmers of New Zealand had the cheek to take Whangarei District Council and Far North District Council to the Environment Court, basically trying to stop these excellent GMO plan changes, which, of course, were only ever for a period of 10 years. You know, when you have a district council plan change, it's only for the duration of that particular plan. Things do get reviewed every 10 years or so. There is nothing valuable or useful on the horizon. So it's difficult to know why Federated Farmers of New Zealand wasted both our council's time and money, the time of primary producers and ratepayers in the north, and, of course, their own members. They're hard-working members of Federated Farmers to appropriate their money and sources on this ill-advised crusade was quite offensive.
Well, as a volunteer, Zelka, we know of the hours that we have to put in. The telephone calls, the emails, the meetings, the producing reports, the submissions, writing submissions. Listeners don't understand. I mean, we were...
And going along and speaking to those submissions meant that I had to leave the farm, not pick avocados, not, be working in the nursery, the plant nursery. Instead, having to go to meetings and having to dress up, which was most annoying. Having to put on a frock.
Yeah, well, all of this, it's astounding the amount of work a volunteer does. And, I want to call out for all volunteers on all levels. We are the glue that actually keeps society together. And it's a real big one. Now, I'd like to just quickly move across over, and you can come back to any subject you want, Zelka.
Yes, I would like to mention how amazing the mana whenua of Taitokara have been. Ngātiwai, Ngātui, the whole lot of them. They were absolutely staunch and fierce on this issue. And I have to say also the Soil and Health Association, Aotearoa New Zealand, and GE Free New Zealand, they have really been amazing and tenacious. And stood with us side by side and put a lot of money into it.
Yes, well, Māori have a profound connection to Mother Earth, Papatuanuku, and they will not allow any more exploitation, if they can help it, of this being that supports the human race.
That's right. And Te Waka Kaiora, the National Māori Organics Organisation, Percy Tepene, who, of course, has since passed away, sadly. They have just been absolutely staunch. And Ngāpui called a hui in November 2012 on this very issue, GMO, and it was unanimously decided that they would oppose any outdoor use of GMOs in the rohi.
Yes. Now, media, mainstream media. What a struggle it is to get them to report on it, because every reporter essentially is there to put this whole process down. They're not here to say, yes, New Zealand can be a GE-free country. We will have one of the greatest point of differences when it comes to high-quality, nutrient-dense organic food that'll have the whole world want it, so that all our farmers across the country, we could become one of the most successful stories in New Zealand, and yet mainstream media won't really run with it.
Well, I have to say, the national media has been, and I have to say particularly the New Zealand Herald, I mean, they often won't even publish a letter to the editor, even if you rigorously observe all of their rules, only 200 words allowed, full name and contact details, blah, blah, blah. Yet they still don't print it. But I have to say, in Taitokara, in the north, over the many years, I think particularly when reporters would attend some of the public meetings or some of the council meetings, and they would see these aggressive Crown Research Institute employees or scientists and Federated Farmers of New Zealand lawyers sent up from Wellington to Taitokara. I think the reporters, when they saw these people basically attacking the councillors and trying to thwart local democratic process, they became quite sympathetic. And at a certain point, I think the mayor of Whangarei, Cheryl Mai, Mayor John Carter of the far north, all the councillors and staff, began to be this real sense of pride. It must have been something like with the whole nuclear-free movement.
Yes.
When communities moved from nuclear-free symbolic zones to having rules or bylaws and local councils' plans, it really became quite a movement. And at a certain point, at least local media definitely came on side.
Yes, well, Northland Advocate too out of Whangarei has, I've noticed one or two when I've been passing through articles. So it's been wonderful anyway for the local region to realise that the importance of reporting on what's happening is imperative. And so congratulations to the very localised media across Northland.
Yes, I mean, Lindy Laird, for example, just on the 1st of June, big article, Federated Farmers pulls out of Northland GMO policy fight with a wonderful photo of the Whangarei Growers Market, which is, of course, a GE-free market, and all of these wonderful articles and images. Of course, we would be sending them down the line to our farming colleagues in Hawke's Bay and different areas, and I just wanted to briefly mention how Hastings District Council has also, in recent years, they've actually achieved an outright ban on all outdoor use of GMOs for the duration of the plan, which again has come under attack by Federated Farmers of New Zealand. So it's very gratifying to see what our councils have achieved in the north. It's now spreading down the line, and we really would like to see an official regional exclusion zone in some of these regions like Hawke's Bay and in the South Island.
Yes. Yes, well, I'm sure that there are people, particularly in the Marlborough and Nelson area, Golden Bay, all through there, that could really get an advantage in the world when it comes to either organic wines and all the other produce that comes from the area. So there is now, Northland has basically put a stake in the ground for the future of New Zealand, really, hasn't it?
I would say Northland and Auckland and Hastings District in Hawke's Bay, we put a clear stake in the ground, and I'm pleased to say that Nelson City Council, local people in Nelson, and the council have been maintaining a watching brief on all of this litigation and court cases, and now that we have an unequivocal win in the courts, the jurisdictional issue has been settled. And also, last year, in April 2017, we had the wonderful result with the Resource Legislation Amendment Act 2017, in which it specifically details that councils do have the right to create enforceable GE-free zones. Now, that was a major battle because, of course, when the National Party was in power, one of Nick Smith, the former supposed Minister for the Environment.
Yes.
It's difficult to say his name in association with that ministerial position, really. But he tried very hard, Tim,
yes,
to basically block the good work of local councils and to strip them of their authority and jurisdiction. Well, thanks to the Maori Party staying staunch, they did not succeed. And so we now have not only the valuable case law, but we have the fact that Parliament has recognized the right of councils to create these GE-free zones. So that will be of great use to other councils around the country, both the ones who are going to transition from their symbolic GE-free zone existing policies to councils who haven't looked at this issue before. It's now all possible and quite straightforward.
Yeah, very good, because I know I ripped into the Māori Party. I'm on the Māori roll, you see, and I said, you stay with the, keep this GE out of New Zealand and make sure you tell the National Party. Now, there's another thing, too, that really sort of got me worked up was, at one stage there, they were very concerned that the Niwa, or down in Wellington, they had rubber stamp sort of trials throughout New Zealand, and the story was, that's for GE, and the story was that if there was a problem and there were GE mishaps, it was the ratepayers and the people of that region that had to pay the bill. It wasn't the Monsantos of the world. And I just couldn't believe that they would allow this. And I think Nick Smith was involved with this as well. And so we've been able to get rid of this, slam this right out. Can you help me with this? Because it's sort of far memory now. And
I'm not sure what you're talking about when you talk about NIWA. Can you just clarify a bit?
Okay, well, there would be some authority in Wellington that would allow biotech companies to come into certain regions in New Zealand, and if they did an experiment and the experiment went out of control, the cleanup...
You're saying that the liability.
The liability, thank you.
Yes. Well, look, it's been an ongoing problem. The Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act was put in place in 1996. And under that act, the HASNO Act, first we had IRMA. You remember IRMA? And now we have what's called the EPA.
I'm getting mixed up. NIWA is to do with atmospheric science. I'm getting mixed up. IRMA was the one.
Yes. So it was IRMA and then the EPA. But both are just, it's a name for an organizational agency that functions under the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act. And the problem is that the HASNO Act is deeply flawed. There is inadequate liability provisions, and there is no mandatory requirement for IRMA or the EPA to take a precautionary approach to these outdoor GE or GMO applications. And even worse than that, in recent years, the various Crown Research Institutes, particularly SCION, have been trying to distance themselves from the whole GE GMO issue, partly because they realize that there is so much resistance.
Okay.
In New Zealand, and the councils have done all this excellent work. They're now trying to say, oh, no, this isn't genetic engineering, this isn't genetic modification, this isn't transgenics, this is cisgenics, or this is zinc finger nuclease, or this is, it's always about these risky new genetic techniques.
Gene editing?
Yes, and now we have CRISPR and gene editing.
Yes.
And it was just such a disgrace before the last election when the National Party was frantically trying to retain its position. Did you notice that in the lead up to the election that the former Minister of Conservation, Maggie Barry, all of a sudden began to wax poetically about how much the National Party cared about the native birds in New Zealand, which was pretty rich because they had cut the budget, DOC's core biodiversity budget, for the last 9 years. All of a sudden, they were very worried about native birds and indigenous biodiversity. And Maggie started claiming that we needed to use GE GMOs and these new techniques, gene-drive CRISPR, and that these would be the magic silver bullet that would kill all the possums and all the stoats, and, we would live in a paradise. Unbelievable cheek.
I'm speaking with Zelka Grammer. She is the chairperson of GE Free Tai Tokerau, which is inclusive of Northland. I agree with you. She has lost so much credibility over the years. Profound. Where once she was a top gardening host on TV and, as you say, waxing lyrically around the garden, now she's just seen as a pawn for big business.
Well, I remember her getting a pretty hot reception in Whangarei in the far north because she came up before the election and gave some, I can't remember what it was some perhaps donation or some partial restoration of the funding for DOC's biodiversity budget. And I remember several of the core forest and bird people and the council basically being very, very withering. And it was reported in the Northern Advocate, again, with people basically saying, too little, too late. And I remember sending a stinging letter to the editor saying, now that you've given up, meaning the National Party, on their whole push for having these risky outdoor GE crops and claiming that they have higher yields and claiming that they use less herbicides and basically a pack of nonsense, now they've changed tack. It's always these cunning sort of emotive arguments, which on the surface no one could argue with. Everyone, of course, wants to see our native birds safe, but this would be a very risky, untested, and unproven way to go about doing it. And I'm very pleased to say that not only am I repped with the new government, with Labour and the Greens and New Zealand First, but The new Minister of Conservation, the Honourable Eugenie Sage,
Yes.
has knocked all this on the head, and she has told DOC and Predator Free 2050 Ltd and various organizations like Land Care Research in no uncertain terms that this is a risky, unproven, untested new technology, and that it would put at risk New Zealand's valuable GE-free status. And, of course, people can continue to apply to the EPA to do either, hopefully, ethical, humane research in the strict containment of the lab, and they can also apply, as they have done in the past, for completely, I would say, completely extreme and insane proposals, like Ag Research, who proposed, it must have been 10 or 15 years ago, they wanted to do an experiment out of doors with a blend of 11 different species to create some kind of strange transgenic creature or animal that they wanted to have secret field trial locations, supposedly to produce valuable pharmaceuticals in the milk of this creature. And GE Free New Zealand, I remember Claire Bleakley, the president, was very strong on this, and I think they raised, would have been $45,000 or something, to take Irma, who approved this, to the High Court. And Justice Clifford overturned the decision and pointed out that it never should have been approved, and recalled him saying something along the lines of that he was confident that the average Kiwi would feel extremely uncomfortable with such controversial experimentation on, innocent animals. Just think of the high animal mortality rates and gross deformities and...
Yes, oh, sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So it is wonderful to have a new government and a new Minister of Conservation who actually has the experience and credentials to address some of the very important issues that are challenging New Zealand. Not only the GE, GMO, risky new genetic techniques issues, but climate change, stopping new coal mines on public conservation land. It is really a wonderful change for the better.
Well, I think we also need to call that the judiciary. Once they hear the story, they realise that the volunteers, the people who are wanting to get GE off our coast, away from this country, they actually see the point time and time again.
Well, look at the different judges in the Environment Court, the High Court. Look at the independent commissioners, for example, who sat in on the Northland proposed regional policy statement. Look at the Sustainability Council of New Zealand. There's another example. There was that dodgy New Zealand Crown Research Institute, Scion,
yes.
their application for this new technique called zinc finger nuclease. They basically had no success with their genetically engineered pine trees.
Yes, I heard
and
that.
I note that their GE pine trees that they tried to plant out at the Scion facility at Rotorua,
Yep.
3 times were destroyed by person or persons unknown. And they began to try this tack of using these new techniques and applied to the EPA, who, of course, as usual, rubber-stamped it. Well, the Sustainability Council took them to the High Court, and the judge found in favor of the Sustainability Council, overturned the decision, and noted, I recall, that the EPA wasn't even in keeping with the law, with a deeply flawed decision.
Oh, yes. Yes, and then you just mentioned that we had to get money together for the Sustainability Council to take Scion to courts. Is that right? I mean, we're having to work hard and get donations from people. I mean, this money could be spent on our home, on our children, on our education. It's always a case where we're having to work from the back foot to go forward to be able to stop these corporations that have huge amounts of money to be able to just bulldoze this whole experiment ahead, isn't it? It's a big one.
No, it's absolutely shocking. And, of course, it is so important for people to support financially and become members of and make donations to the Sustainability Council of New Zealand, to the Soil and Health Association of New Zealand, because it is not easy maintaining this very high level of opposing these types of things. And I'm just looking at the Sustainability Council of New Zealand's press release from the 22nd of May, 2014. I'll just read out. The High Court has quashed a decision by the EPA that would have allowed developers of genetically modified crops to bypass New Zealand's GM laws. The court found that the EPA misinterpreted the law when it decided that GMOs from 2 new breeding techniques could go into New Zealand fields without any formal consultation or assessment of the impacts. The EPA was also criticized for failing to act cautiously in the face of uncertainty. This was not a routine approval for a minor field trial. This was the EPA putting new methods for making GMOs beyond the law without having properly understood that law or properly investigating consequences. This decision would have placed New Zealand at risk of losing overnight its status as a GM-free food producer without a public process to assess what would be lost. The Council believes that such failures raise serious concerns and questions about the EPA's reliability as a guardian of the environment.
We should sue those guys. They need to go into court and be charged, and they need some time in jail. I mean, they are... Do
you mean the board of the EPA, or do you mean the Crown Research Institute, Scion? Because the problem is, of course, Scion is a CRI. It's publicly funded. And this is the really annoying thing, is that they continue to appropriate public tax dollars, including yours,
yes,
to push for undertaking these risky out-of-door experiments. We're not talking about ethical, humane research, including for medical purposes, in the strictest containment of a laboratory. We're talking about them pushing to do these things outside. And I'm really hoping that the new government will dismantle that former, what was it called, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, where they had a science board which was filled with basically pro-biotech stooges, in my view.
Yes.
And dismantle that, or at least make sure that the science board is not dominated by people with links to the agrochemical and the biotech industry. I mean, I recall that Dr. William Rolleston, who is called that because he was formerly a GP, but he was on the science board, and he and his colleagues repeatedly gave millions of dollars of funding to the NZCRIs to do this type of risky proposals. And also pastoral genomics. There's an organization called Pastoral Genomics.
Can you speak louder? Yep.
Pastoral Genomics is its name.
Yes.
And they're very keen to undertake large-scale GE grass field trials in New Zealand, which is of great concern because grasses, of course, are one of the most promiscuous genetically engineered varieties. You know, the pollen, the plant material. You could never have, say, a field trial of a GE grass in a particular location and keep it separate from conventional or IPM or organic properties.
Yes, I heard about that. There's a particular grass on the Snake River, somewhere up, I think, in Oregon, that Don Huber talks about. And the whole thing is, it's just been swept down the river and it's gone all the way out into the Pacific Ocean, and, you know, the seeds and whatever, there's huge problems around that particular type of grass. So
But it's not just grasses. It's all the vectors for contamination from these GE or transgenic crops, or even what they call cisgenics. The vectors for contamination are so many. You know, it's the wind, insects, pollen, soils, machinery, obviously extreme weather events, human error, and basically overseas they have given up the false claim because they used to claim that you could have a GE field trial or a GE crop over here and it could be kept separate. Remember they used to use this phrase called coexistence?
Yeah, no wind.
Yeah, they used to call it coexistence, and formerly here in New Zealand, MAF and MPI used to push that line as well. But it's completely been disproven. It is either impossible or so grossly expensive to even try. And now overseas, what they're saying is that basically you have to accept a level of contamination. And they're very busy criticizing the organic sector and saying your standards and your rules are too strict. You need to accept a contamination level, which, of course, here in New Zealand, we absolutely have no intention of doing. We have a proud zero-tolerance policy for any GE content in imported seeds. And I understand that the Minister of Agriculture and Biosecurity, Damien O'Connor, is working very hard to make sure that is adequately resourced. So we have a lot to celebrate.
We do. It's like a breath of fresh air. And we needed that. We needed to be able to fill up again. So because we were being drained, we were tired, we were always running on empty. And so it's fantastic. And
but we were also angry. I think sometimes when people are arrogant and push too hard,
yes,
and certainly in the case of in Northland, people became quite outraged at, Crown Research Institutes from outside the area or from Federated Farmers of New Zealand trying to undermine local democratic process. And so it made them more strong and tenacious. And, of course, the wonderful thing was I can recall driving down to Auckland to deliver a truckload of organic avocados and tamarillos and various things and going to one of my big customers and his produce manager running out and saying, he's got a check for you, a donation. And I'm thinking, for GE Free Northland, I'm thinking $100, maybe $200. $9,000. $9,000.
Well done.
And it was quite funny because I had a meeting scheduled for to meet with my local MP, Winston Peters, at the time. And it was like, rush back up to Whangarei for the meeting with Winston or go in and see the owner of the business and accept the $9,000 check. Well, and it was really touching because you would get that, but then you would get envelopes with $10 and a book of stamps from some elderly woman in Kaitaia. So people really dug deep, and now there is a great sense of pride and relief. And I also would say full credit to Katie Milne, the new current president of Federated Farmers.
Okay.
She is the one who finally made the call.
Good on
Dr.
her.
William Rolleston, the former president of Federated Farmers of New Zealand, Dr. William Rolleston, showed no indication or inclination whatsoever to stop the vexatious appeals and litigation. So it is wonderful now to have some new leadership by withdrawing from those legal challenges. Katie Milne has done Federated Farmers proud, and basically her decision to pull all the vexatious appeals against the various councils, this is in the interest of all New Zealand farmers and primary producers, including the members of Federated Farmers, and allows councils to proceed with sound GMO-free policies that reflect the needs of local growers and primary producers and communities.
Zelka, this is wonderful. Now, Zelka, is there any little story that you can tell of how the community came together to let people realise that when we do volunteer and work together, some wonderful things happen? I mean, friendships really establish, and you know the true goodness of people. And it's important for us to know that we're not alone.
That's right. That's right. And by standing together, we can achieve so much. And I've been very, very impressed by the tenacity of local farmers and ratepayers and our councils. We can at last get on with creating value for local businesses and Northland's reputation in the global marketplace. We have our valuable Northland Naturally brand, and we have a lot to celebrate, basically.
Yes, I'm glad. Believe me. I mean...
And I do have many stories. I mean, I can remember being at the Royal Commission into genetic modification back in 2000 and being cross-examined by Monsanto. And afterwards, during SMOCO, I happened to overhear a couple of them, and they had lawyers there in like a flash Armani suit, sort of whispering to each other and saying things like, how do you fight these people? They work for free, and, they meet at a venue, just like I'm speaking to you now from a venue, free of charge, supported. How do you combat this? They were spluttering with rage, pretty much, and so New Zealand has a proud history of doing this, nuclear-free, GE-free. It's very exciting, and it is an absolute privilege to work with so many people who have focused on this issue and have come out the other end triumphant.
Very much so. It was interesting. I know Professor Robert Mann, who was involved way back with the nuclear-free issues, and particularly he had a Royal Commission, and in this Royal Commission he maintained he had everyone who was going to make a submission or talk to this put their hand on the Bible and swear that they would tell the truth.
Yes, but that was not required during the Royal Commission into genetic modification.
That's right.
Dr. Robert Mann said at the time, he said they were free to perjure themselves, and they were. It was disgraceful.
Very much so, and I'm glad that you have heard the story too, because he has mentioned it time and time again to me. What it does, it's somewhere, should we say, at soul level or at a deep part of your being, you make a commitment to either tell the truth and make sure that what you are saying is for all of humanity, or you can be basically a sneaky liar.
Dr. Robert Mann has been wonderful supporting. He's been an expert witness for us at times when we've presented to the councils, and he did direct me to, there was a very interesting paper by Dr. Morgan Williams, the former Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment,
Yep, I met him.
On the rapid adoption of hazardous new technologies. And it talked about, nuclear reactors and CFCs and thalidomide and
1080.
Asbestos, and he didn't mention aerial 1080, which is of huge concern. But in that paper by Dr. Morgan Williams, he mentioned how it's bad enough that human beings have this tendency to rapidly adopt these hazardous new technologies, thinking, of course, that they're solving a problem, thinking, of course, that it's a good idea. And they don't realize, they're ignorant of the fact that they're ignorant. It's only 5 or 10 or 50 years later that they realize, to their horror, the radioactive material from the nuclear reactor or the effect CFCs have on the ozone layer. But he said even worse is that when there is a financial interest, and of course GE and GMOs with the ability to patent living things and the seed crops of the world and proprietary interests, when there is negative information or documentation of harm to the public health or the environment, they suppress it because of the financial imperative. So that is of huge concern.
It is. Well, you see, my pet project regarding to GE and why I really got into it, I have always asked, I want to see 10 generations of rats only being fed GE soybeans, GE maize, GE rice, GE potatoes, and see what happens to the babies that are born.
Well, there's already been, I think, Seralini did a 2 or 3 year feeding trial on rats, which had horrendous results with tumors and all sorts of gross deformities. So there are a number of feeding trials that have showed quite serious adverse health impacts. The other thing, though, that really annoys me is how the pro-GE or the biotech people, on the one hand, they claim that these GE crops are so different and unique, and obviously they are because it's a blend of different things. They're using viral promoters, antibiotic-resistant marker genes, but they claim that it's so different that they can patent it and they can have proprietary rights. And, of course, what's happened is when they contaminate others, they sue the very people that they've contaminated. But how can it be that it's so different that you can patent it and have proprietary rights, and yet when it comes to processing that crop into food, then they claim it's the same, and it doesn't need to be labeled. It's substantially equivalent. Well, that's clearly not the case.
Yeah.
And it's obviously the kiss of death. Normally, when you have a new product that you're proud of and that consumers want, you label it. You would have a image of Wonder Woman on your tin of GE tomatoes with GE emblazoned on her breast, proudly. But no, it's shh, keep it quiet. Make sure it's invisible so that when hardworking people go to the supermarket to buy cereal or whatever, that it's invisible to the eye what is in the packet, which is obviously completely unethical.
Oh,
and pregnant women, people with low immune systems, young children, the elderly, they are the most vulnerable, of course, to not only the GE content, but they've applied overseas for higher parts per million residues of glyphosate or Roundup in the GE crops. So there's a very good reason to avoid those types of products. And I would really like to see this new government. I understand that Gareth Hughes, who's the Green MP who has the portfolio for primary industries, he's very hot on achieving, along with Honourable Damien O'Connor, a comprehensive GE labelling regime and removing those exemptions.
I'm so glad to hear this, solely because of glyphosate. We've done a lot of interviews around that. It's a very, very dangerous technology. We are going out of time now, and I just want to say to you, Zelka, this has been a wonderful, insightful, and a great learning for me, this interview. So I want to say kia ora to you for your up and go, because you've been doing this for years and years and years and years.
Yes, well, I am half Sicilian, so I got very brassed off at a certain point, which makes me very motivated. But I also want to thank you, because you were one of the many people. I saw your name in the list of the 300 or 400 original submitters to the Auckland proposed unitary plan, supporting those sound, precautionary and prohibitive GMO provisions. I saw your name in support of the Whangarei District Council and Far North District Council collaborative GMO plan changes. So you're one of the many people who have stood together to great effect and protected the right of our local council. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone whose name has not been mentioned today. I'm just one of many, and a particular thank you again to the mana whenua of Taitokerau, who were such an inspiration to me on a personal level.
Thank you so much, Zelka. Thank you. Lovely to hear your voice.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Hold on. Hey. Oh, you did so well. That definitely was Zelka Grammer, chairperson of GE Free Taitokerau for the Northland region. What a dynamic presenter. We are grateful. Decide to network. Use every letter you write, every conversation you have, every meeting you attend, every email you send. And remember, even Facebook. To tweet and to express your fundamental beliefs and dreams. Affirm to others the vision of the world you want. Network through thought. Network through action. Network through love. Network through the spirit. You are the center of a network. You are the center of the world. You are a free, immensely powerful source of life and goodness. Affirm it, spread it, radiate it. Think day and night about it, and you will see a miracle happen. The greatness of your own life in a world of big powers, media and monopolies, but of 7.6 billion individuals, networking is the new freedom, the new democracy, a new transparency, and a new form of wholeness and happiness. This originated by Dr. Robert Muller, Chancellor of the World Peace University in Costa Rica, Central America. I invite you to be able to come to greenplanetfm.com, where we have over 400 interviews in our database, which you can readily download and listen to be able to inspire yourself to become the change you want to see in the world and become involved in caring for your children and grandchildren's future. We are also on Facebook, on Green Planet FM and ourplanet.org. Please come and love us.